Welcome to Health Code Blueprint. Today, we're walking through one of the most foundational components of inpatient coding, principal diagnosis selection. This presentation is built around Section 2 of the official coding guidelines and the UHDDS definition that governs all inpatient reporting. Before we begin, here is our disclosure. This presentation is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal, compliance, or billing advice. Always follow official ICD-10-CM guidelines and organizational policies. The principal diagnosis is defined by the UHDDS as that condition established after study to be chiefly responsible for occasioning the admission of the patient to the hospital for care. This means the final principal diagnosis is determined after diagnostic and therapeutic workup is complete. It is not necessarily the admitting diagnosis, and it may differ from the provider's initial impression. The principal diagnosis is the condition that most clearly drove the need for hospitalization, excluding complications. This definition applies across acute care, long-term care, psychiatric hospitals, rehab, home health, nursing homes, and hospice. When selecting the principal diagnosis, there is a strict hierarchy that guides every coding decision. At the top are the ICD-10-CM conventions found in the tabular list and alphabetic index. These conventions override everything else. The next level is the official coding guidelines, including Section 2 on principal diagnosis selection. Only after applying conventions and guidelines do we turn to medical record documentation to determine the correct sequencing. As the document states, coding conventions in the tabular list and alphabetic index take precedence over official coding guidelines. This hierarchy ensures consistency, accuracy, and compliance across all inpatient encounters. Rule A is your first filter. If a definitive diagnosis is established, stop. Do not assign a Chapter 18 symptom code as principal. If no definitive diagnosis is established, go. The symptom may be assigned as principal. This rule prevents overuse of symptom codes when a clear diagnosis exists. When two or more interrelated conditions both meet the definition of principal diagnosis, for example, conditions from the same chapter or one being a characteristic manifestation of another, you may sequence either condition first. This flexibility applies unless the tabular list, index, or circumstances of admission dictate otherwise. In rare cases, two unrelated diagnoses equally meet the criteria for principal diagnosis. When this occurs, coders should review circumstances of admission, diagnostic workup, therapy provided. If both remain equal, either diagnosis may be sequenced first. When documentation states diagnoses in an either or format, code them as if confirmed. If circumstances of admission clearly support one diagnosis, sequence that one first. If not, either may be sequenced first. For inpatient coding, uncertain diagnoses must be treated as if they are confirmed. When documentation uses terms such as probable, suspected, likely, questionable, possible, rule out, or consistent with, the condition is coded as though it exists. This rule applies only to inpatient encounters and is based on the diagnostic workup, observation, and initial therapy provided. As the guideline states, these terms act as triggers to code the condition as established when selecting the principal diagnosis. If a patient is admitted for a specific condition but treatment is cancelled due to unforeseen circumstances, the principal diagnosis remains the condition that occasioned the admission. Cancellation does not change the principal diagnosis. When a patient is admitted specifically for treatment of a complication, the complication code becomes the principal diagnosis. If the T80T88 code is vague, assign an additional code to describe the specific complication. If a patient is placed in observation for condition A and is later admitted because the condition worsens or fails to improve, then condition A becomes the principal diagnosis. When a patient is admitted after outpatient surgery due to a condition or complication identified during post-op monitoring, apply the UHDDS definition. Select the condition established after study to be chiefly responsible for the admission. If the admission is due to a complication, the complication is principal. If the admission is for another reason, the principal diagnosis is the reason for the surgery. Let's bring everything together with a quick, practical roadmap. When you're selecting the principal diagnosis, think of this decision matrix as your real-world guide. Start by asking, is there a definitive diagnosis, or are we still in symptom territory? That's Rule A if you're dealing with two conditions that are closely related, or even two that seem equally responsible, you have flexibility. Rules B and C remind us that either one can be sequenced first, as long as the tabular list doesn't tell us otherwise. When documentation presents either or diagnoses, Rule D steps in. Treat them as confirmed and sequence based on the circumstances of admission. For inpatient cases with uncertain diagnoses, those probable, likely, or rule out situations, Rule H tells us to code them as if they're established. If treatment was cancelled, Rule F keeps us grounded. Stick with the condition that brought the patient in. And when the admission is for a complication, Rule G makes that complication the principal diagnosis. Finally, the timeline rules, I1, I2, and J, help us navigate observation stays and admissions following outpatient surgery. They ensure we anchor our decision to the true reason the patient required inpatient care. At the end of the day, everything comes back to one core principle: the circumstances of the admission always drive the principal diagnosis. Coding conventions, guidelines, and documentation all work together, but the story of why the patient needed inpatient care is what ultimately guides your selection. These rules aren't just technical requirements, they're tools that help us capture the clinical truth with accuracy and consistency. When we apply them thoughtfully, we support better data, better reporting, and ultimately better patient care. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in our next video.